closely at the author of the song that we just sang, Lord, I Believe. On page 377, you will see that it was written by a man by the name of A.W. Dykes. And then if you go over to song number 9 in the book, very familiar song, Our God, He is Alive, is written by A.W. Dykes. Brother Dykes was a Christian scientist, and I mean that literally. He was a Christian who was a scientist. He was the head of the physics department at Tennessee Tech University in Cookeville, Tennessee, for quite a while. Prior to that, he was involved in the atomic bomb project in Oak Ridge, Tennessee. That was, at that time, very secretive. But Brother Dykes was one of the most renowned scientists of his day. But in the late 60s and early 70s, he became very concerned with movements across college campuses that were the God is Dead movement. And maybe some of you can remember that from those days. And it was that movement that caused Brother Dykes first to write, Our God, He is Alive, to counteract those thoughts that were so prevalent on American college campuses then. And then he wrote, Lord, I Believe, that we just sang. And both of those songs carry the same theme. I had a meeting in Cleveland, Ohio, in which Brother Dykes' grandson picked me up at the airport. And we were talking about these two songs. And he said, I'll have to show you something really neat. And so later on in the week, he showed me the handwritten first copy of Our God, He is Alive in pencil that his grandfather had written many years ago before it was ever published. And I just thought, as I held that in my hand and I looked at that, I thought, wow, you know. But yeah, Brother Dykes was a faithful Christian, and he just was very dedicated in his faith. He was a great scientist. But he was first and foremost a Christian. And thankfully, he was able to put those two songs together. His grandson told me it irked his grandfather, however. Both of those songs have 4 verses. And he said it would irk his grandfather when the song leader would lead verse 1 and verse 2 and skip to verse 4. So we led all 4 verses tonight, and that would have pleased Brother Dykes. Henry, welcome back, buddy. I tell you, he is a trooper. We were talking before service. A bunch of us would have milked that for all it's worth. You know? He went to school today after having surgery. Was it yesterday morning? Man, that's great. Turn it to 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 7. 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 7, and as soon as you get there, you're going to say, oh, I already know that. And you do. It simply says, we walk by faith and not by sight. That's one of those statements of Scripture that is so easy to repeat. It is so easy to tell somebody who's going through a hard time that you just need to walk by faith and not by sight. But it's not so easy to live. So my question tonight is, what does that mean? We walk by faith and not by sight. What does that mean? Hold that thought. We'll come back to it in just a moment. As you go through the Bible, from beginning to end, I don't know if you've noticed it or not, but the Bible presents a series of unforgettable walks. You don't get very far in Genesis, and there is God walking in the cool of the day in the garden, calling out the name of the first man, Adam. There was the hard walk of Abraham up Mountain Moriah with his son in tow, and every step taken by the old man was excruciatingly painful. Not because of the elevation climb, but because he knew what God had asked him to do. There was the walk of Moses and the Israelites along a path that had previously been part of the Red Sea. There was Joshua's triumphant walk with the army of Israel around and around and around the walls of Jericho. In the New Testament, I read of a couple disciples. And they were on their way home. They were walking to their little village of Emmaus, which was 7 miles from Jerusalem. They had been disillusioned with the crucifixion of Jesus. They had been disciples of Jesus. And so downtrodden and discouraged, they're walking home. And then this stranger joins them. Unknown to them at the time, it was the resurrected Jesus. And later when they put the pieces all together, they looked at each other and they said, "Were not our hearts burning within us when he walked with us along the way?" There was Saul's interrupted walk, headed to Damascus with papers in hand. It would be a walk that would change his life. There was the walk of the Savior from the Praetorium to Golgotha, a walk that would change your life. And how many times is the Christian life compared to a walk? Ephesians 4 and verse 1, 1 Thessalonians 2 and verse 12, walk in a manner worthy of the calling with which you have been called. But one of the most unforgettable walks of all was taken by the Apostle Peter the night he made a decision to get out of the boat and walk on the water. Unforgettable because of what he was walking on. Unforgettable because who he was walking with. I think Peter's invitation as Jesus invites him to come and walk on the water, I think in that picture we have an invitation for all of us to step out in faith and take a walk. An invitation to do, with God's help, what you can't do by yourself. An invitation to live 2 Corinthians 5 and verse 7. We walk by faith and not by sight. There are times when individuals, we need to take God by the hand and we need to go for a walk of faith. There's times when churches need to take God by the hand and go for a walk of faith. Does it involve risk? You know it does. Does it involve an element of fear? It sure does. But does it involve faith? Every time. But one thing is very sure, and that is if you're ever going to walk on the water, the first thing you have to do is get out of the boat. My Bible's open to Matthew chapter 14, beginning in verse 22. Matthew chapter 14, beginning in verse 22. Immediately he, that is Jesus, made the disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side while he sent the crowds away. After he had sent the crowds away, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. We talked about how Jesus would often do that last evening. And when it was evening, he was there alone. But the boat was already a long distance from land, battered by the waves, for the wind was contrary. In the fourth watch of the night, translate, between 3 and 6 in the morning, he, Jesus, came to them, the 12, walking on the sea. When the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified, and they said, "It is a ghost." And they cried out in fear. But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, Take courage. It is I. Do not be afraid. Peter said to him, Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water. And he said, come. And Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came toward Jesus. But seeing the wind, he became frightened. And beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. Immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and took hold of him and said to him, you of little faith, why did you doubt? When they got into the boat, the wind stopped. And those who were in the boat worshipped him, saying, you are certainly God's Son. So the 12 get into a boat and go across Galilee, as they've done many times. But this particular evening here in Matthew chapter 14 tells us that a storm blew in, not exactly a minor squall. Verse 24 says the boat the disciples were in was battered by the waves. The word literally there is tormented. The boat was being tormented by the storm. John tells us in his account in John 6, they've been rowing 3 or 4 miles against a strong wind. And by this point in time, it's getting late or early, depending upon your calculation. It's around 3, 4, 5 o'clock in the morning. And by now, the disciples aren't exactly worried about getting to the other side as much as they're concerned about staying alive. And that's when they saw the shadowy figure of a man moving in their direction. Verse 26, like all of us, they were convinced they were seeing something. They were seeing a ghost, perhaps. And they were terrified, it says. They cried out in fear. I heard somebody one time, and they were very critical of the 12 for not recognizing Jesus immediately. And the comment was made, how would these men not know this was Jesus? Who else did they think it would be? And I thought about that, and I thought, we do the same thing. How often are we terrorized by fear in our life, battered by waves of turmoil or trial of some kind, and we don't recognize the nearness of God with us any better than did they? So maybe we shouldn't be so quick to criticize them. But here's my question. What's Jesus doing? And why is he doing it? What is his motive? I want you to hold your finger here in Matthew chapter 14, and I want you to go over to Mark's account in Mark 6 and verse 48, because Mark adds a little something that Matthew does not. Mark chapter 6 and verse 48. Let's see what Mark adds to this. Mark 6:48. Seeing them straining at the oars, for the wind was against them, at about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them walking on the sea. That's pretty much what Matthew said. But it's the last phrase that caught my eye. He came to them walking on the sea, intending to pass them by. What's that about? He says he was intending to pass them on. Well, I don't know the answer to that, except to say that throughout Scripture there are certain defining moments where God presents himself to man in such a striking way to communicate to man an unforgettable message. That's why in the Old Testament it says God put Moses, as we sing about, in the cleft of the rock, quote, while my glory passes by. On another occasion, God told Elijah to go stand on the mountain, for the Lord is passing by. Here comes Jesus walking on the water, intending to pass them by. pattern? Well, I don't know about that, but I know this. In each of those situations, and many, many more, it was at a critical juncture for God to get man's attention. And so whether God appears in a burning bush, or the quaking of a mountain, or Jesus coming and walking on the water, this is God doing something at a very critical moment of time, demonstrating His divine power and presence, and doing something only God can do. So before Jesus takes these 12 men any further in this ministry, He has to get their attention in a way they won't forget. And I think He succeeded. Because you got 12 men in a boat, filled with confusion and wonder and terrorizing fear. And then one of them recognizes the presence of God and has an idea. Peter decided he'd like to go for a walk. So what I want to do, the few minutes we have left, I want to take 2 Corinthians 5:7. We walk by faith and not by sight. And I want to merge it with this scene we just read in Matthew chapter 14. Because out of Matthew chapter 14, we find four facts or four definitive meanings as to what it means to walk by faith. Four applications of 2 Corinthians 5:7, we walk by faith. There's four applications of that here in Matthew chapter 14 that we just read. So if you're taking notes, write this down. If you're going to walk by faith, number one, you have to get out of the boat. For years, artists have tried to recreate certain scenes in the life of Jesus. And sometimes they don't do very well. For example, Leonardo da Vinci's very famous painting, The Last Supper. You've seen that. That's probably one of his most famous paintings. You see it everywhere. And every time I look at da Vinci's painting, The Last Supper, I have to smile. Because he gets it wrong. For one thing, he's got them all seated Western style, like we sit at a table. And they didn't do that back then. And the second odd thing in the painting, if you look, he's got them all seated on the same side of the table. I had a friend of mine call me up one day. He's one of these guys at church. He always has the joke of the week. And he calls me up and he says, "Do you know the last thing said at the Last Supper?" And I said, "No, I don't." He said, "Yeah, Jesus said, guys, if you want to get in the picture, get over on this side of the table." Well, I think about that every time I look at that painting. You know? And it's the same thing when artists try to paint Jesus walking on the water. We used to have a big family Bible, and in that big family Bible, there would be all of these pictures that artists have drawn, and there was a picture in there of Jesus walking on the water. And I can still see it to this day. And so here's Jesus in this long flowing gown, and the moon is full, and the water is just glassy still, and the artist's rendition is Jesus just tiptoeing along on this glassy lake. Beautiful. It wasn't a glassy lake. It was a storm. It was a terrifying storm. You can imagine the size of the waves and the strength of the wind and the darkness of the night. And by this point in time, the disciples are exhausted anyway. And put yourself in Peter's place when he realizes it's the Lord passing by. And Peter says, "Lord, if it is you, bid me to come to you on the water." So you have a choice to walk on the water or to stay in the boat. Because the boat represents what's safe. The boat represents what's comfortable. The water is rough, the waves are high, the wind is strong, and there's a lot of things that can go wrong if you get out of the boat. But if you don't get out of the boat, there's a guaranteed certainty, as in 100%, that you'll never walk on the water. See, what does this have to do with me? Well, I'm fixing to tell you. Every one of us has a boat. We all have a boat. Your boat is what represents safety to you. Your boat is what represents security to you. Your boat is your comfort zone. That's what it is. It's where you're tempted to put your trust. In Matthew chapter 6 in the Sermon on the Mount, Jesus said, for where your treasure is, that's where your heart's going to be. And for some people, their money is their boat. As long as I got plenty of money and I know where it is and I know how much I have, I feel so safe. With other people, it's their vocation. We talk about job security. With other people, it's relationships. As long as I got my family around me, then I'm very comfortable with that, and that becomes their comfort zone. With others, it's success. With others, it can be other things. But it represents our comfort zone. That's what it's all about. Sometimes churches have boats. Did you know that? Sometimes a church building can become a boat. That can become a safety sense of safety and comfort for that particular congregation. And it's all about, I've been in churches, it's all about their building. With other churches, it's tradition. Their boat becomes tradition. This is the way we've always done it, and we ain't ever going to change, is the mission statement of many a congregation. Doesn't matter that there may be other ways to do the same thing that might even be better. But tradition is our boat. We're not going to get out of it. With some churches, it's saving money more than saving souls. That's the most important thing. We all have a boat. And I've noticed that we like to stay in our boat. And I've noticed that we don't like somebody coming along and rocking our boats. What if it's the Lord that's rocking your boat? And what if it's the Lord who's standing nearby and he says, get out of your boat and walk over here to where I am. Come to me. So the first point we're going to make tonight about walking by faith is, if you're going to walk by faith, you have to be willing to get out of your boat, your comfort zone. Secondly, if you're going to walk by faith, you have to understand the storm may not just go away. I've run into people sometimes, they think if they just have faith, they're going through a hard time in life, and if I just have faith, then the Lord's going to take the storm away. The Lord's just going to say, hush, be still. Well, he may not. The storm didn't go away just because Peter got out of the boat. Did you notice that? And speaking of that, in my mind's eye, I see Peter going over to the edge of the boat. Now, 22 eyes are locked on him. Because they've been with him before, and they've seen him shoot his mouth off one too many times, and in their minds, I'm sure they're thinking, let's see how far he takes this one. And in my mind's eye, I see Peter throw the leg over the side of that boat. And then another leg. And I see his knuckles as white as they can be as he hangs on to the edge to make that final decision. And then Peter does something off the charts religious. He lets go. He lets go. And for a moment, he abandons his life to the person and power of Jesus. And Peter is beaming, and Jesus is smiling. And then it happens, verse 30. But seeing the wind, he became frightened. And beginning to sink, he cried out, Lord, save me. I wrote down the words, reality check. Because all of a sudden, Peter realizes He's on the water in the middle of the storm, and the boat's over there, and he can't reach it. And I'm thinking, going through his mind are the thoughts, maybe this wasn't such a great idea. And fear sets in, paralyzing fear, because we don't always want to walk by faith. We'd rather walk by sight. There's a guy by the name of Larry Lawden in one of his books. It's a business book. And he talks about risk management. He says, we live in a society that is so fear-driven. He says, we suffer risk lock. It's like gridlock. We become so afraid we are unable to take the necessary steps that would energize our lives. I don't know if you know this or not, but everything you do in life is risky. Everything. In this country, every year, 25,000 people approximately are treated in hospital emergency rooms for injuries they sustained when they fell out of bed. So I want you to think about that tonight when you go home and get ready for bed. And you climb in that bed, you're taking a risk that it might land you in the emergency room. 25,000 people a year go there for that reason. Everything is risky. Everything. I had my little granddaughter with me several years ago. We were over in Lexington. And we went to Kentucky Horse Park one day. She loved horses, and we had horses, and so she was all about horses. And so we went there and spent the whole day there together. She was probably about 10 years old at the time. And we just had a ball. And she said, can we sign up for the trail ride at 2 o'clock? And I said, absolutely. And so we went over there, got signed up for the trail ride, showed up on time, and they handed me 4 pages of lawyer legalese. You've seen these pages. And it was all about how this horse that you're going to ride will probably hurt you and maim you and kill you, and all of the ways it could possibly do that. And so you're supposed to read 4 pages of that and then sign your name that says, I don't care, and I'll not sue you, and all that kind of deal. So I'm just looking at all of this, glancing through it, signed my name, handed it to them. So they matched us up with all the horses. And they had 2 groups of people, riders and non-riders, and of course we had horses, and so I was the rider group, and so everybody's got their, my granddaughter got her horse, everybody's got their horse but one person. Me. And so I'm standing there, and this guy says, you're okay with any horse? And I said, I think so. And he said, well, we've got just the horse for you. And that sounded funny. And so about that time, out of the barn, they led this horse that happened to be the biggest horse I've ever seen. It was a Belgian horse. Think Clydesdale. And they said, his name is Big Boy. And I thought, well, that's appropriate. And they lead this horse out, and they said, he's the most gentle horse we have in the barn. He's the biggest horse we have, but he's the most gentle horse. And he loves going on rides, he said, but he often doesn't get to go because he scares everybody. He's so big, he just scares everybody. And so he usually gets left behind. And so he'll be a great horse for you and all that kind of deal. And I said, well, and they said, you have any questions? I said, yeah, I have a question. They said, what is it? I said, how do I get on him? They brought a step ladder out. I had to go up 3 rungs on the ladder to get high enough to throw a leg over this horse. And so I get on this horse, and we take off on this ride. And I'd ridden less than 5 minutes when I realized why nobody rides these horses. Because the girth of these horses is so big. My right leg is pointed in that direction. And my left leg is pointed in that direction. And I'm thinking, I read 4 pages of how this horse is going to hurt you. And not one thing was said in those 4 pages that if you ride this horse, you'll never walk straight again. Nothing. You know? plate, you may strike out. The best ones do. But if you don't step up to the plate, you'll never know the glory of hitting a home run. And if you don't ever get out of the boat, you never know the glory of what it means to walk by faith. Third, if we're going to walk by faith, we have to accept life challenges, aka storms, as the price we pay to grow. We have to accept life challenges as the price we pay to grow. Now go back to the text in verse 30. It says, as Peter got out of the boat and began to walk on the water, but seeing the wind, he became frightened and beginning to sink. He cries out, Lord, save me. Did Peter fail? Let's go down the list. Did his faith waver? Yeah, it did. Did he take his eyes off the Lord? Yeah, he did. Did he sink down in the water? Yeah, he did. Did he scream, Lord, save me? Yes, 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 and yes. Peter failed. And we get up and we preach all these sermons about how Peter failed. And I don't think, as I look at this scene in the life of Jesus, I don't think that's the story of failure. I think the real story of failure in this scene are count them, 11 men who sat in the safety of the boat and didn't have the courage to get out. Those 11 men failed privately and quietly. We don't talk about them. The only one we talk about that bears the brunt of our scrutiny happens to be the only man who had the courage to get out of the boat. And because he did, Peter was the only one of the 12 who knew what it was like to walk on the water. He was the only one of the 12 who knew what it was like to do something man can't do. He was the only one who knew the joy when he felt like he was sinking as he reached out his hand to find the hand grasped by the hand of Jesus and pulled to safety when he could go no further. The other 11 never experienced that at all. And because he got out of the boat, he shared a moment, a connection, a trust with Jesus the other men never had. Why? Because they were too afraid to get out of the boat. The worst failure in our lives is not the fear of sinking, because we walk by faith. Our worst failure is to always just stay in our comfort zone. You and I will never grow spiritually until we get out of our boat. Dads, if you want to lead your family as the God-man of steel and velvet and set the example of what faith is all about, then you're going to have to show your family what it means to get out of the boat. Moms, if you want to teach and train your children as the matriarch of faith of Deuteronomy chapter 6, to teach your children when they sit in your house and when they walk by the way and when they lie down and when they rise up, then you have to set an example of what it means to walk by faith. Elders, you want to do the greatest work in the world? Then you challenge us, you motivate us, you cast a vision for us. You be out front leading and showing a congregation what it means to walk by faith. The status quo is easier. The walking by faith part is harder. So what have we said? If you're going to walk by faith, you have to get out of the boat. If you're going to walk by faith, you have to expect there's going to be challenges. And third, you have to accept those challenges as the price to be paid to grow. And the last thing I want to say is, if we're going to walk by faith, that's when you connect with the living God. There's a lot of reasons to get out of the boat. The number one reason is Jesus isn't in the boat. He's over here and he says, come to where I am. The problem is we go through life, we want to comfort code everything. We want to construct this manageable life where everything is secure and everything is predictable. We buy insurance and we insure everything, all of the while maintaining this illusion, I am in control. When in reality, you're not in control of much of anything. And then God comes along and rocks your boat. Or he allows Satan to rock your boat. Remember Peter and Satan? Jesus said to Peter, Satan has asked permission to sift you like wheat. In other words, Satan said he's going to rock your boat, Peter. And what do you do then? You get out of the boat and walk over there where Jesus is. That's what you do. Jesus said, come. Come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, and I will give you rest. One more thing out of the text I want to ask you in verse 31. As Jesus reached and took hold of the hand of Peter, immediately Jesus stretched out his hand and took hold of him and said to him, you of little faith, why did you doubt? Verse 32. When they, Jesus and Peter, got into the boat, the wind stopped. Two questions. How did Jesus get back in the boat? Well, you say he walked on the water. Okay. Question two. How did Peter get back in the boat? You think Jesus grabbed Peter and said, oh, ye of little faith, hope you can swim. You think that's what it was? Or do you think Jesus lifted Peter back up to where he was, and together they, Jesus and Peter, walked on the water and got back into the boat? Something to think about. The application goes everywhere. We're so good at making excuses as to why we can't get out of our boat, why we can't get out of our comfort zone. It could be inviting others to come and worship God with us, and all of a sudden, here we go. Well, what if they won't come? What if they reject my invitation? What if they reject me? How will you ever know if you don't get out of the boat? Or we could go down the idea of hospitality. Here's the excuse. Well, I'm busy. We have a really small house. I work outside the home, and maybe when the kids are grown, maybe when my husband retires, stop. Because hospitality has nothing to do with any of that. We spent the last, I would say, 3 decades defining what hospitality is not. And I've heard it. If I've heard it once, I've heard it 100 times. Hospitality is not just having people in your home. Got it, check. But isn't that a part of it too? When was the last time you opened your home to some of the folks in the congregation that maybe you need to get to know a little better, and you invited them into your home to put their feet under your table? I was at a meeting in Texas, and that week I remember eating in some very nice homes. Oh, very nice homes. But that's all a blur. Because there was one evening, this young couple, they were both grad students at Texas A&M, and they were both trying to go to school, and they were both trying to work, and they had this little bitty house they were renting, and their only vehicle was a motorcycle that they shared. And they signed up the meal list. And so I go over there for the meal, and there was barely enough room to even sit at this table. And when I think back to that meeting, that's the one thing, that's the one place that sticks out in my mind. Because this young couple had every reason not to do that. But they threw it all out and got out of their boat and did it anyway. Sometimes I go preach places, and somebody invariably will come up and they'll say, we just got married. You're our first company. And I often think, great. What's this going to be like? And at one place in this company, they said, then you're our first company. And And I said, oh, okay. And the little bride looked at me and she said, could you bring something? I said, sure. What would you like me to bring? And they said, a chair. They said, we only have two. So I found me a folding chair and I took it. And I sat down at their table, was a card table, and sat down with them. It was great. We had a great time. But I noticed that passing food around, there wasn't a lot. And she passed me the peas, and I'm putting some green peas on the plate. And the little bride said, I didn't know how many green peas to make, so I made enough for all of us to have 10. So I'm looking at my plate, realizing I've overdone it. So I took my plate and I put some back in the bowl, you know. But I think about those things. Here's people who had every reason not to do that. They did it anyway. You know, I love that. Maybe it's going to the funeral home. I've had people say, I don't go to funerals. I don't ever know what to say. I just don't even go. And I think to myself, how hard is it to say, I love you and I'm praying for you? Is that hard to say? And I'll tell you a little secret. Many of you know this. Little secrets, no secret. They're not going to remember what you say anyway. But they are going to remember if you showed up. Get out of the boat and show up. So the application of this lesson goes a lot of different ways. It could be teaching a Bible class. It could be participating in service. It could be a number of things. We just got to have the courage to get out of our little comfort zone and trust in Jesus and walk by faith instead of walking by sight. Thanks for listening. We sing the song of invitation. Is that it? Trust and obey. We sing the song of invitation. If you need to respond in obedience to Jesus, we're talking all week long about do you know my Jesus? And we're looking at various scenes in his life. And if you need to obey the gospel and be baptized for the remission of your sins, or you owe duty to God in some other way, if we can help you or talk with you, there's folks here who will do that. Let us know. Won't you come while we stand and sing together?